The veterans' hall in Riverside smelled of old wood, faded flags, and the faint trace of spilled beer that never quite left the floorboards. Every Tuesday evening, Harold Bennett sat alone at the corner table, a quiet figure in a worn jacket, nursing a single pilsner. His hands, twisted by arthritis, rested calmly on the table, steady despite their age. On his wrist, barely visible beneath the thin skin, was a faded tattoo of an anchor, a relic from a lifetime ago. Harold was not a man of words. He was a monument of silence, understood only by those who carried their own ghosts. The other veterans respected his quiet presence. They spoke in nods, in brief glances, in gestures that carried more weight than any story. They knew that the men who had seen the most were often the ones who spoke the least. Harold's silence was not weakness, it was a verdict, a truth carved by years of service and sacrifice. That night, however, the rhythm of the hall was broken. A man in his late 30s strode in, brimming with restless energy. His name was Jason Carter. He wore tactical pants, a t-shirt with a skull emblem, and a cap bearing the insignia of Special Forces. He didn't simply enter the hall, he occupied it. His voice boomed as he ordered drinks, gathering a small group of younger veterans around him. Jason spoke with polished confidence, weaving tales of daring raids in Afghanistan, peppering his speech with acronyms and jargon. His audience leaned in, captivated by the drama of his words. Harold watched from his corner, his gaze steady, betraying nothing. He had heard men like Jason before, loud, brassy echoes in the long hallway of memory. Their stories were polished, but hollow, lacking the grit of truth. Jason's arrogance grew with each laugh and nod from his listeners. He pointed at a black and white photo on the wall, Marines at the frozen Battle of Chosin Reservoir. "Respect to them," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But that's ancient history. We're the future. They were sledgehammers. We're surgical instruments." His gaze swept the room until it landed on Harold. He saw only a frail old man in a cheap jacket, a relic of the past. A smirk spread across his face. "Hey, Pops," Jason called out. "You serve?" Harold lifted his pale blue eyes, meeting Jason's for the first time. He gave a single, slow nod. Jason chuckled. "Army cook, maybe." His followers laughed nervously. Harold said nothing. He simply looked at the man wearing an emblem he had not earned. The silence in the hall grew heavier. The veteran shifted uncomfortably. Disrespecting an elder here was a sin. But Jason, drunk on his own performance, pressed on. He leaned closer, his words sharp as a blade. "You wouldn't know anything about it, old man. This is modern warfare. Real reckon. Not your black and white newsreel war." The hall fell silent. Harold's eyes did not waver. He had heard this before. And he knew exactly how to answer. Jason Carter's voice filled the hall, bouncing off the old wooden walls like a performance on stage. He thrived on the attention, his stories growing more elaborate with each passing minute. He spoke of firefights in valleys, of calling in airstrikes, of daring escapes that sounded more like movie scripts than military reports. His audience, mostly younger veterans who had not yet learned to separate truth from bravado, nodded eagerly. But the older men in the room shifted uneasily. They had heard this kind of talk before. They knew that the ones who had truly seen combat rarely spoke of it so loudly. Frank, the bartender and a Gulf War veteran, caught Harold Bennett's eye. Harold gave the faintest shake of his head, a silent warning. Let him talk. The truth would reveal itself. Jason, emboldened by the silence, turned his attention back to Harold. He saw only a frail old man, a relic of another era. "You wouldn't know anything about it, Pops," Jason sneered. "This is modern warfare. Real reckon. Not your black and white newsreel war." The room froze. Disrespecting an elder in this hall was a cardinal sin. The veterans exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for Harold's response. Harold set down his glass, his pale blue eyes locking onto Jason's. His voice, when it came, was quiet, raspy, but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "You said you were in the Korangal Valley," Harold stated, not asked. Jason puffed out his chest. "Damn right. 18 months of hell." Harold leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. The room seemed to shrink, every ear tuned to the space between the two men. Then Harold asked a question, simple, innocuous, yet devastating. "What was the name of the stray dog at Observation Post Kilo?" Jason froze. His smirk faltered, replaced by confusion. "What? What kind of stupid question is that?" "There were dogs everywhere. Who remembers a dog?" He tried to laugh, but the sound was hollow. The veterans weren't laughing. They were watching, waiting. They knew the truth was in the details, the small things you only remembered if you had truly been there. Jason's bravado cracked, his confidence slipping away. Harold didn't press further. He didn't need to. His silence was a verdict. The air grew heavy, charged with tension. Jason shifted uncomfortably, sweat forming on his brow. For the first time, his story seemed fragile, his armor of arrogance pierced by a single question. His silence in the Riverside hall was suffocating. Jason Carter shifted on his feet, his bravado crumbling under Harold Bennett's quiet question. The younger veterans exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in power. Harold had not raised his voice, yet the weight of his words pressed down on the room like a storm cloud. Jason tried to recover, forcing a laugh. "Dogs? Who cares about some mutt? That's ridiculous." But his voice cracked, betraying the panic beneath. The veterans weren't laughing with him. They were watching, waiting. They knew the truth lived in details, the kind of details you only remembered if you had truly been there. Before Jason could spin another lie, the heavy oak door of the hall swung open. A slice of late afternoon sunlight spilled across the worn floorboards. 3 men entered, 2 in crisp modern army uniforms, flanking a tall figure in a dark suit. The man in the suit carried himself with absolute authority, his silver hair gleaming under the dim lights. The hall's commander, Henderson, nearly dropped the glass he was holding. His voice stammered. "General Whitaker, sir, we weren't expecting you." General Samuel Whitaker, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, offered a polite nod, but his eyes were already scanning the room. His gaze swept past the bar, past the stunned faces of the patrons, and then stopped. It locked onto Harold Bennett. The general's entire demeanor changed. The hard lines of his face softened into reverence. He bypassed Henderson and walked directly toward Harold's table, his polished shoes making no sound on the old linoleum. Jason Carter stood frozen, his face pale as the 4-star general approached. General Whitaker stopped in front of Harold. He clicked his heels together, his body snapping to attention. His salute was sharp, flawless. His voice, a deep baritone, filled the hall. "Sergeant Major Bennett," he said. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." A collective gasp rippled through the room. A 4-star general was saluting the quiet old man in the corner, and calling him sir. Jason's mouth fell open, his arrogance shattered in an instant. Harold returned the salute slowly, deliberately. His pale eyes held the general's gaze. "Samuel," he said quietly. "It's been a long time. Please, have a seat." The hall was no longer Jason's stage. It belonged to Harold. General Samuel Whitaker stood tall before Harold Bennett, his salute sharp and unwavering. The hall was frozen in disbelief. A 4-star general saluting a frail old man in a worn jacket, and calling him sir. The weight of that moment pressed down on every soul in the room. Jason Carter's face drained of color. His smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow stare. He had strutted into the hall with arrogance, but now he looked like a child caught in a lie. The younger veterans who had been hanging on his every word shifted uncomfortably, their admiration dissolving into shame. Whitaker's voice carried authority, but also reverence. "For those of you who do not know," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room, "This man is Sergeant Major Harold Bennett. He wasn't just in the Marine Corps. In many ways, he was the Marine Corps." The hall erupted in whispers. Harold remained still, his pale eyes fixed on the general, his expression unchanged. Whitaker stepped closer, his tone firm. He was one of the founding members of Force Reconnaissance. He didn't serve in the Korangal Valley, he wrote the doctrine that men in Korangal were still trying to live up to 60 years later. Jason flinched, his body trembling. Whitaker's words cut deeper than any insult. The general's presence was undeniable, his authority absolute. "Sergeant Major Bennett served at Inquan," Whitaker continued. "He was one of the 33 heroes at the Chosin Reservoir who held off an entire Chinese division for 3 days. He spent 21 days behind enemy lines in Vietnam with a broken radio, 2 bullets in his leg, and a single canteen of water. And he walked back to base with intelligence that saved the lives of over 3,000 men." The room fell silent again, the weight of history pressing down on everyone present. Jason's arrogance had been obliterated. He stood exposed, a fraud in front of legends. Whitaker's eyes locked onto Jason, cold and unyielding. "And about that dog," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "At Observation Post Kilo in Paktika Province, Afghanistan, there was a scruffy stray mutt the men adopted in 2009. They called her Greta. Every man who served there knew her. It's a detail you only know if your boots were on that ground." Jason's lips trembled. Sweat rolled down his forehead. He tried to speak, but no words came. The truth had crushed him. Jason Carter stood frozen, his cap trembling in his hands. The hall was silent, every eye fixed on him. General Whitaker's words had stripped away the last shreds of his bravado. The truth was undeniable. Jason had never been in the Korangal Valley, never shared rations with Greta the stray dog, never lived the details that only real soldiers carried in their bones. Whitaker's voice hardened, carrying the weight of command. "Take off that hat," he ordered. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the kind of order that had sent men into battle, the kind that brooked no hesitation. Jason's hand shook violently as he snatched the cap from his head. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room, searching for escape. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze. The younger veterans who had once admired him now looked away in shame. The older men stared with cold judgment. Without another word, Jason turned and fled. He shoved the heavy oak door open, disappearing into the fading light of evening. The hall remained silent, the echo of his departure lingering like smoke. His arrogance had collapsed, leaving only disgrace in its wake. The spell was broken. Harold Bennett's quiet dignity had been defended, not by his own words, but by the truth of his legacy. The fraud was gone, and in his place, a legend had been revealed. General Whitaker lowered himself into the chair beside Harold, his demeanor shifting from commander to respectful subordinate. "I was in town to dedicate a new memorial," he explained softly. "But I couldn't miss the chance to see you again. Your after-action reports from Korea are still required reading at Quantico. They're studied as perfect examples of reconnaissance and resilience." One by one, the veterans approached Harold's table. They didn't crowd him or demand stories. They offered simple gestures, a firm handshake, a nod of respect, a quiet "thank you for your service, Sergeant Major." Frank the bartender appeared with a fresh pilsner for Harold and a glass of fine whiskey for the general. His voice was thick with emotion. "On the house, gentlemen." Harold's vindication was complete. His honor restored, not by loud proclamations, but by the quiet truth of his life. In the days that followed, Riverside's Veterans Hall carried a new kind of silence. It was no longer the heavy quiet of forgotten men, but the reverent hush of a place touched by history. The story of that evening, of Jason Carter's humiliation and General Whitaker's salute, spread quickly among the members. It became a quiet legend, whispered with respect, retold with awe. Harold Bennett himself did not change. He still arrived on Tuesdays, still sat at his corner table, still nursed a single beer for 2 hours before vanishing into the night. But the way others saw him had shifted forever. He was no longer just the quiet old man in the corner. He was a monument, a living reminder of sacrifice and resilience. Younger veterans began to approach him, not with arrogance, but with humility. They didn't ask for war stories. They asked only to sit near him, to share the silence that seemed to carry more weight than any tale. A nod from Harold meant more than 1,000 words. His presence alone was enough to inspire. Frank the bartender noticed the change most of all. The hall felt different now. The faded flag seemed brighter, the old wood sturdier. Men carried themselves with a little more pride, spoke with a little more respect. The fraud was gone, and in his place, truth had taken root. One evening, a young Marine fresh out of service entered the hall. He spotted Harold at his usual table, hesitated, then approached. His voice was nervous but sincere. "Excuse me, Sergeant Major," he said. "Would it be all right if I bought you a beer and just sat with you for a while?" Harold looked up from his glass. For the first time in years, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. He nodded slowly. "I'd like that very much, son." The cycle of honor had begun anew. In the quiet corner of Riverside's hall, the torch was being passed from one generation to the next. Weeks passed, and Riverside's Veterans Hall settled into a new rhythm. The story of Harold Bennett's quiet vindication became part of the hall's fabric, retold in hushed tones, carried like a sacred memory. It was not shouted from rooftops, nor written in newspapers. It lived in the silence, in the respectful nods exchanged between men who understood what true honor meant. Harold himself remained unchanged. He still arrived with the same slow steps, still wore the same worn jacket, still sat at his corner table with his single beer. Yet the atmosphere around him had shifted. He was no longer invisible. He was a monument in plain sight, a living reminder of courage that endured without fanfare. The younger veterans began to treat the hall differently. They spoke with more restraint, listened more carefully, and carried themselves with a quiet pride. They had seen arrogance destroyed and humility exalted. They had witnessed what it meant to be a soldier beyond the battlefield, to be a man of integrity. General Whitaker's visit was remembered as a turning point. His salute to Harold was not just a gesture, it was a declaration. It reminded everyone that greatness often hides in silence, waiting to be recognized. The hall itself seemed transformed. The faded flags looked brighter, the old wood sturdier, as if the building itself had absorbed the dignity of that moment. Harold never spoke of Jason Carter again. He didn't need to. The fraud had vanished, leaving only the truth. And the truth was enough. One evening, Harold sat quietly as usual, when a group of younger veterans approached. They didn't ask for stories. They simply stood near his table, their presence a silent tribute. Harold looked up, his pale blue eyes softening. He gave a slow nod. It was permission, acceptance, and blessing all at once. The hall was no longer just a place for drinks and memories. It had become a sanctuary of respect, a place where honor was not spoken loudly but lived quietly. And at the center of it all sat Harold Bennett, the quiet monument of Riverside. The Riverside Veterans Hall glowed softly under the dim lights, its walls lined with photographs of battles long past. Harold Bennett sat in his usual corner, the quiet figure who had become the heart of the hall. His presence was no longer overlooked. He was a living monument, a reminder that true honor did not shout, it endured. On a cool Thursday evening, a young Marine named Daniel Ruiz entered the hall for the first time. Freshly discharged, his uniform still crisp, his eyes carried both pride and uncertainty. He had heard whispers of Harold Bennett, the man who had humbled arrogance with silence, the man saluted by a four-star general. Daniel hesitated before approaching the corner table. Harold looked up from his glass, his pale blue eyes steady, patient. Daniel cleared his throat. "Sergeant Major," he said softly, "would it be all right if I bought you a beer and sat with you for a while?" For a moment, Harold said nothing. Then, slowly, a genuine smile touched his lips, rare, but warm. He nodded. "I'd like that very much, son." Daniel sat down, his posture respectful, his voice quiet. He didn't ask for stories. He didn't press for details. He simply shared the silence, learning that sometimes the greatest lessons were not spoken but felt. Around them, the hall carried on, but the air seemed different, lighter, stronger. Other veterans watched, understanding what was happening. The cycle of honor was continuing. The torch was being passed, not through speeches or ceremonies, but through a simple gesture, a young Marine sitting beside an old one, listening to silence that spoke louder than words. Harold Bennett remained the same, a quiet man in a worn jacket, nursing a single beer. But to those who knew, he was more than that. He was proof that true heroes don't always wear capes or demand recognition. Sometimes they sit quietly in the corner of a hall, their greatness hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next generation to notice. And in Riverside, they had.